Hello, my name's Mike Smoyer. I'm president at Digital Government Institute. Thank you for joining us this morning. Multiple government agencies and private organizations were caught off guard last year as foreign hackers broke into a security solution provider and added infected code into their software. As supply chain complexity grows, so does the need for transparency and regulation. Over the next 30 minutes, we will review best practices for implementing updated NIST supply chain guidelines. Before we get started, at any time during this presentation, if you'd like to submit a question, please do so, and we will address the questions at the end of the presentation. You can download a copy of the presentation in the audience console, and if you're having any technical difficulties, follow the same procedure as submitting a question. It's now my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. With us is John Cofrancesco. He's an experienced VP of Business Development with a demonstrated history of working in the DoD, federal, and computer software industry. He's skilled in big data analytics, management, leadership, cyber, and change management. With that, take it away, John.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with DGI. I know NIST standards are maybe the most sexy, attractive thing to talk about. So I thought I would start the conversation rather than just diving in and talk a little bit about why it matters, right? Why do these particular requirements matter? And I think it comes down to saying something that's a little bit of a hard truth that maybe folks don't always want to admit to themselves. I think the reality is that we are, again, as a nation, in some sort of international contest. The first half of the last century, we had a contest to determine if democracy was going to survive in the world. And that was fought with planes and trains and bombs. In the second half of the last century, we had a different contest to determine whether it was going to be capitalism or communism that was going to dominate the world. And although there were still planes, trains, cars, and bombs, that was fought predominantly on the streets of Eastern Europe, in the capitals of Africa and Latin America, and it was fought in classrooms. Today, we have some sort of different contest. It's a contest to determine who's going to control the way humanity goes forward. And certainly our near peer adversary, China, has a very distinct idea about how they want the world to go. They're interested in ending personal freedoms. They want economic hegemony. They want control over all the global communication systems, specifically the internet, and they want regional dominance. And I think everything that NIST does is something that's worth paying attention to, but these particular guidelines, these outlines on how we can approach supply chain are maybe the most important thing that NIST has put out in a long time, because it is really about where the fight is today. Because unlike the previous conflicts today, that fight, the battle for the future of the world is really going to be determined in cyberspace, and it's going to be determined by the economics of communications. You might mistake some of the things I have on the screen here as being well-known products. On the left, you might say, hey, that's an iPhone. On the right, you might say, hey, that's a Humvee. And below, you might say, hey, that's a Joint Strike Fighter. And unfortunately, you would be wrong in every case. The top left is a Chinese knockoff of an iPhone. The top right is what's called a Dongfeng Jeep. It's a knockoff Humvee. And down below is a mock-up of a Chinese competitor to the Joint Strike Fighter. In each of these cases, China, through supply chain attacks, was able to garner information from the United States and was able to replicate Chinese versions of what is truly American intellectual property. So when we talk about supply chain, what are we really talking about? And I think this strikes to the heart of the conversation about why these NIST standards matter and how they take control. When I think about myself as a buyer or as an organization, I'm thinking about, hey, I'm going to my distributor, I'm going to my systems integrator, and I'm buying something, or I'm buying a thing. But in practice, when we talk about supply chain, we're really talking about from the time the ore comes out of the ground to the time the first piece of code is programmed, all the way through to ourselves. And I think that in a lot of ways, what we're seeing here in the new regulatory space is this is an affirmation of what's already been true, but really an aim to folks to get their eyes on it, right? So to think about supply chain in this way, you're not buying a thing from a person or an organization, rather you're buying the whole supply chain. I want to talk a little bit about the regulations before we jump into the NIST, because I think it's important to understand just at a high level what's going on. So we're going to see Buy American Act updates. So if you're a supplier, vendor, contractor to the federal government, you need to be aware of this. The TAA, we're also seeing updates there. Obviously, everybody should be at this point familiar with the NDAA Part 889, basically saying, hey, no Huawei ZTE or Daiwa parts. I'm sure everybody knows about the CMMC, as that's now affecting just about everybody that works in our community. You'll be familiar with programs like Navy CyberSafe, but the biggest one I want to point your eyes to is this DODI 5000.90. And we're going to come back to this, but I share these regulations with you to point out that this administration has recognized that we're having some sort of conflict with China. They've recognized that supply chain is a big vulnerability for us. Obviously, SolarWinds and now the Microsoft Exchange attack is just sort of pressing examples of that. But we are acting as a country to start to put regulations into place to resolve this. And if you're part of the defense industrial base or you're a member of the federal government, right, there are some new regulations in place you ought to be familiar with. And those tie very closely to what NIST is recommended that we do. So now we can jump in. We kind of have this context, right? We have this contest going with China. There are a bunch of regulations to help us get on the right footing to take on that contest. And NIST has put out some key practices around supply chain risk management and cyber supply chain risk management. And the 8 steps here are all really important. I'm going to focus on the ones I have highlighted here, steps 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8. And then I'm only skipping the first set because today I want to focus on what's actionable, right? What are things that we can do right now? And I'm going to assume or make the assumption that if you're focused on this issue, you're going to take care of the other ones inherently. So when it comes to integrating cyber SCRM or SCRM in general, supply chain risk management, you either do that or you're not. It's a very binary thing. Establishing a process, again, if you've appointed the organization, you've appointed the folks, you've probably done that. But how do we know and understand, how do we manage who the critical suppliers are? So that's a little bit different of an animal. And today we're going to focus on those sorts of things, the things that we can leave here with a hard action on. So let's talk about the first one. So know and manage critical suppliers. And for folks who are in the space, really interested in doing this, probably already have been appointed or likely being appointed to be in this SCRM position. How do you do this? How do you know what your risk is? Well, the first thing is you need an inventory of everything that you are buying and from whom you are buying it. And you need to begin to put risk scoring around them. So you need to say, on the basis of who they are, their relationships, how they practice their personal cyber hygiene, and I mean personal as an individual, but rather as an organization, and their behaviors, who is most risky to me? And that needs to be done in context. It needs to be understood, right? That so if I have a relationship with a vendor and they sell me paper, well, that's not very critical, right? But if I have a relationship maybe with the same vendor and they sell me a $5 or $10 servo, but that servo is connected to a nuclear power plant, well, they're a critical supplier for me, particularly if I can't find a replacement for that. So first thing here on know and manage your critical suppliers, get an inventory and then risk rank all of those individual companies and all of the assets they're supplying you. This is a very complex topic, and we can dive into it a little bit. When I go to organizations and I say, hey, do you have an inventory? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. When they don't have that inventory, right, it's a very easy first step. Hey, let's get that inventory. When they do have the inventory, now the hard part comes. We have to understand who's critical. So how do you determine who's critical? Well, you have to do this based on outcome. If this vendor disappeared tomorrow, what would happen to your organization? If the asset they're supplying to you turned out to be a faulty asset, what would that do to your organization and its mission? So when I think about this as a federal contractor, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, I'm really thinking about how can I help my PM comply with their new regulations, and how can I as a company make sure that my supply chain going back is secure. The worst thing that I can do is buy from a distributor who bought from a reseller who actually purchased something from an enemy entity, right, or a banned entity, a Huawei, a ZTE, or even if I purchased it from a quality entity, that asset happened to be vulnerable. So you have to think about the outcomes, and then you have to think about Do I have the pieces in place both to determine what's going to be risky to me and to understand who I need to be looking at from a risk perspective? There's one other thing we're going to come back to here, and I'll touch on it a little bit more as we carry on, but you also ought to be looking at your tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 vendors. A lot of times folks say, well, my prime is Booz Allen, my prime is Northrop Grumman, ergo I'm safe. But really you need to be thinking about, well, who is their sub and who's the sub there and who's the managed service provider for those subs. So it's quite an expansive task, but it's a manageable task. There are tools available, there are talents available to go do this. So again, this major step, know and manage your critical suppliers, get an inventory and do a risk rank, stack rank them, and let's start addressing the ones that carry the most risk to your organization. The second part is understanding your organization's supply chain. So when we talk about understanding the supply chain, it really goes back to that second, third, fourth, nth party supplier and the second, third, fourth, nth party asset or component provider. And you know, I think I've been married now for a while, and I was actually just at my sister's wedding, and I was looking around, and it really occurred to me then, and I've always heard this, right? You marry the family. And I was very grateful, right? My sister's now in-laws are very good people, but there's a lot of truth to that, right? You marry the family, all the things that come with that new husband or wife, the baggage from the family. Well, when you buy an asset, when you engage with the vendor, the same thing is true. You're buying the entire supply chain, so you have to know what you're getting into, right? You don't marry somebody without meeting the parents first, right? You ought not buy an asset from an organization with whom you don't have a strong enough relationship, with whom you don't know what are they providing, what are they getting it from, how are they getting it, how do they check that it's good, what are their QA processes. And as we dive into the NIST guidelines here and we sort of get into the detail, this is a lot of what they're telling us to do. They're saying, hey, you need to ask these questions before you buy, right? So I think the way to look at this, the way to circulate this around your organization, this concept of, hey, let's really dive into it, ought to be focused on this concept, right? You buy the supply chain, you marry the family. And that's the big outcome here. Ask the questions up front before you acquire, and continue to ask those questions afterwards, right? I think everybody right knows the secret Uncle Jim or the crazy cousin Steve, right? Maybe you didn't know about them before you got married, then you got married, you need to ask the questions. The same thing's true here. You find out what the second, third, fourth, fifth tier suppliers are doing, and then query them. Continue to query your vendors. Make sure that you have a relationship with them such that when something comes out, you can dig in on that. Why did you have an M&A with an organization we're not fond of? Why did you open a factory in a country that's adversarial to us? So continue to do that. And as on the right here, you can see I've provided a visualization where 9 times out of 10, you buy an asset, right? So in this case, I've got an F5 load balancer, and you think, okay, well, I've entered into an arrangement with F5. That's just not true. You've actually, in this particular case, entered into an arrangement with 39 different sub-suppliers. And as you go down those sub-suppliers, you'll find that components to that asset, in this case, are actually in violation of the NDAA 889, but in other cases may come from entities who don't have our best interests at heart. So if you're on the government side, continue to ask those questions. If you're in the DIB or the federal industrial complex, then what you need to be doing is you need to make sure from a compliance perspective that your vendor suppliers are secure, but you also need to make sure that what you're providing to the government is secure. So you need to be asking those questions. You need to make sure that you're building and buying the right supply chain. Not a very attractive slide, but maybe one of the most important slides. And this is about maintaining that relationship. So as we go on those 8 steps, this is one of those ones, and if you actually open up their recommendation, it's thin in some respects. This may be the most important piece. It's been my experience, and having spent years in the federal government on both sides as a govie and on the consultant and contractor supplier side, that a lot of questions don't get asked. And if they get asked once for compliance. They're not continuously being asked. So my recommendation here is any contract that you enter into, whether you're part of the Fed or you're part of the industrial complex, place a must report clause into that contract. That's so if they find a new vulnerability on the asset, they must report it to you. If they get breached, they must report it to you. If they buy or are purchased from a company or a nation that's adversarial, they must report that to you. So if you want to have the collaborative relationship, a lot of these vendors are going to be reticent to do that. You have to put it in the contract. If they are not willing to do that, then that would be like marrying somebody, right, who didn't introduce you to their parents. Maybe you should question that. Maybe you should have concerns there. The second thing, when you're buying an asset, make the vendor supply you a bill of materials. And this is the hardest one. So if you're a small organization, the likelihood that the big companies, your F5s of the world, your Cisco's are going to supply you the bill of materials is, basically 0 to none. But if you're a government organization or you're representing a government organization, you have a lot of leverage to make that vendor supply you the bill of materials. And when we talk about the bill of materials, what we're talking about are the actual constituent components that go into a device. And those components could be hardware, so think chips and magnets, or they could be software. And I think one of the things that's often overlooked, and that's why we have it listed here, right? Supply the software bill of material, is you might have a vendor who's really good. You might have hardware, all made in America, really good, but they're supplying software for that asset that actually is made by our foreign adversaries, or large components of it are made by our foreign adversaries. And that's a pretty common thing. A lot of organizations don't do a really strong job at providing or even controlling their own software bill of materials. So if you're in a position to lever up here, this is one of the areas to do that. Make them supply you that bill of materials so you can do an analysis on it to make sure there aren't old versions of libraries there that have, various vulnerabilities that you're unwilling to accept. And I'll put this into context. Every year in this country, people die in hospitals because hospitals are breached, and often they're breached because they have OT, operational technology, operational equipment that has vulnerabilities, not because the hardware is bad, but because it has software on it that's never been updated. Because they didn't have that software bill of materials, the hospital had no clue sort of how to defend it. And usually those come in the form of ransom attacks. So, hey, we're not going to give you the medical record, or we're not going to let you turn on the oxygen machine until you pay us. This is true also in the federal government. So where we see vulnerabilities, we see them more often on our industrial control systems, our operational technologies. Often in the commercial realm, you're seeing this in factories, right? So a factory shuts down for 2 days, nobody knows why. Really what's happened is they've been ransomware attacked, and the way the bad guys got in is through this weak software that came in the bill of materials. So that's a really important thing if you can get it from them. The last thing that you have to do, and it has to go into the contract, is have a plan of action around supply. And what does that mean? Well, as part of your service contract, when you buy an asset or you enter into an agreement, you can say, hey, here are the expectations on how you're going to supply us this item. Now, that happens pretty frequently in the commercial world, not as frequently in the government world. Usually there's like a one-liner that says, hey, you're going to deliver this item on this date, but they don't always go into the how. So did it come from a trucking company we trust? Did it go through, if it was shipped into the United States, did it go through ports that can be trusted, or did it have stops in adversarial countries? And I'll point out that huge swaths of the IT systems we bring into this country are filled of counterfeit parts because they've stopped in ports where counterfeiting is the business, or where they've come from places where you thought you were getting something from factory one, you were really getting it from the factory next door, and nobody chose to tell you about that. So put a plan of action in place around supply, and that supply ought to consist of things. Well, if there's a political emergency, a weather emergency, a climate emergency, how do you make up for this? And I think we all know in the pandemic that this is something that burnt us really badly. And this is something that's so easy to do. Your vendors won't resist doing this. So if you're in the government side, you have a lot of leverage. If you're in the industrial complex side, even there you have some leverage to put these things into contracts, and that's what you ought to do. And then make that a monthly or quarterly meeting with them to make sure that they're meeting the ends of that plan of action, that they're still doing what you've agreed to on contract. The next step that we're going to cover is really talking about the assess, monitor throughout the supplier relationship. And for us, this really waters out into two things. The first is what we're going to talk about. I call it FOCI, some call it FOCI. I'm going to go with FOCI though, because I like FOCI better. And it's really about foreign ownership, control, and influence. So just because the organization you entered into an agreement with today is American does not mean it's American tomorrow. And even if it stayed American, it doesn't mean that that American company didn't go purchase foreign assets that are inherently risky to you. So you need to be monitoring this throughout. And again, if we've done the right things in contracting, we can get some sense of this, but you ought to be doing an analysis of all of your vendors and all of your assets for where they're coming from and what relationships they're getting into. And what we find often is that you have these major multinational corporations from whom we're buying loads and loads of stuff as a government, as a federal industrial complex, as a defense industrial base, that have relations that are unacceptable. They're entering into minority banking agreements with Gazprom from Russia. They're entering into technology, intellectual property sharing agreements in China. Key thing to remember here is you can't enter into a business relationship in China without agreeing to also sharing intellectual property. So if your major vendor has just opened up a new office in Shenzhen, what they're really saying to you is that some portion of what they're building for you is now going to be handed over to China, and that may not be a thing you want. So you have to be monitoring this both before you buy and throughout the process. Fortunately, industry has provided a slew of tools. My business does this. We have competitors, a slew of tools to monitor this, but you need to be doing this, and you need to be doing this in a way that, again, back to that communications plan, that vendor understands if they do take on a behavior that's unacceptable, that's going to cost them maybe the contract, maybe the renewal. And again, even in the industrial complex side, we have a lot of leverage to do this. There are a lot of ways that you can contract in, hey, we only want parts that come from certain factories. We only want relationships with certain organizations. The last thing I'm going to do is talk about plan for the full life cycle. And this is one of those things that I think everybody talks about, maybe not everybody does. And I want to put this into a particular context, and we call this vulnerability risk management. And again, this talks about outcomes, really focused on outcomes here. So let's talk about the bad guys everybody knows about, right? Huawei, ZTE, Daiwa. Well, let's think about that. So if I have a vendor supplying me an asset and they have magnets that come from Huawei, that's not great. It's definitely an NDAA violation. But in truth, that's not the end of the world, right? That's not going to cause my company to melt down. That's not going to cause me in all likelihood to lose my contract with the federal government, particularly if I'm honest about fixing it. But if I'm supplying a network card or a communications card, if I'm supplying chipsets that come from those organizations, 5G equipment that comes from those organizations, I'm going to have a major problem, both from a security perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective. So vulnerability risk management is about quantifying what that risk is. And it's also about respecting that supply chains don't end. I think one of the things that folks think about is they say, well, I bought the asset, I checked the vendor was good. I don't need to do anything with that vendor anymore. This is now an asset I have full control of. The asset, we reviewed it has parts only, say, from the United States, so it feels good. And they think, well, my supply chain's ended. The reality is basically everything receives a patch today. That's why patch management is sort of that last tail in vulnerability risk management. You need to be continuously reviewing all the updates, all the patches that are coming. So I'm ranking things on the basis of outcome, right? I'm understanding, hey, the magnets are less concerning than the servo probably less concerning than the network card, depending on its use. And I'm respecting the fact that there are going to be patches coming down the pipe, all of which are focused on updating my technology. So these are really the major parts of NIST. Hopefully you've gotten some hard action items here. For those in the federal government, particularly in the DoD, I said I was going to come back to the DOTI 5000.90. This is a new regulation. It was signed at the end of December of this year. And if you're a PM, pay attention to this one. I'm going to just read off a couple parts here that are really important, but cybersecurity being foundational to national security and supply chain security being foundational to cybersecurity. This instruction is directing all PMs to do a number of things. First, it's telling them to start doing supply chain risk management. It's telling them, I'm going to go on to a next slide here, visualize what you have. Look at the cybersecurity of the organizations you're working with, and not just CMMC. It doesn't cover it, and it isn't just your cyber team. You, the PM, are responsible. Doesn't matter if you're buying pencils, you're buying satellites, you have to look. Of course, there is a hierarchy of importance there. And they're asking you to visualize this. If you're in the defense industrial base or you're in the federal industrial complex, be aware that the PMs are now having to do this and support them in that. So as you have contracts with your suppliers and vendors, share that information with those PMs, do it in a way that's going to give them the ammo to comply, but also do this as an effective mechanism for you to win more business. It's my view, and particularly as this regulation follows, and you'll see as I've pulled up the pieces here, follows very closely the NIST best practices, you're going to have a lot of PMs saying, hey, the vendor who's more clear on that supply chain is the vendor I'm going to go with, right? The one who can meet those requirements are the ones that I'm going to do business with. And by the way, if you're in the defense industrial complex, you're in the defense industrial base, you can get your PMs to include this into the contract requirements if you're doing that shaping work, and you ought to if you're on the up and up. Huge opportunity, I think, for the folks who are doing the right thing. And if you're on the government side, huge opportunity for you to deduce who you really want to work with, who's doing the right things to keep our country safe. So in terms of content, that's really what we have today. Hopefully there have been some good takeaways for you, hard actions that you guys can look at. But the main thrust of this is really about understanding that there are a slew of new regulations, slew of risks out there that we have to address. And for any patriotic person, this is one set of NIST standards that is really critical. This is one of the ones that we really have to commit to, because our adversaries are looking to use this to get after us. So I appreciate it. We'll see if we have any questions, Mike, and thank you for the time.
Thanks, John. We have 4 or 5 questions here. The first one, please talk about the difficulties identifying lower tier suppliers below our primes.
Yeah, so there's 2 pieces to this. So if you're in the government, unless you put this into the contract requirements, they are going to resist you day and night, right? Because a lot of the defense industrial base wants to close their eyes. They don't want to know that their distributor bought something from a reseller who's out of bounds. They don't want to know necessarily, because they don't want to be in violation themselves, and they feel as though not knowing is safety. So here's how you do this. Make it a contractual requirement, no malarkey there. The second thing you need to do is you need to be monitoring it. So that you can do this manually. It's a lot of work. There are a ton of tools out there that do this data-driven. Some of that already exists and is available, depending on what organization you're a part of. But it's something you need to be doing, and you can make that a line item in your contract to say, hey, you must supply me updated information on your supply chain. And you can do that on the DIB side too, but certainly if you're in the federal side, it's something you can do mandate.
This was a follow-up question by Andy as well. Are there standard, quote, must report clauses in the FAR?
So the FAR has some interesting pieces there. The long and short is that what's available to you is not sufficiently strong to do the job. Actively, the Biden administration working with, actually this is bipartisan, it's like one of the few things that folks agree on. Susan Collins of Maine actually brought this up years ago, and she got shut down. She now has Mark Warner of Virginia and others working with her to put a bill together to update those. So long and short, there are some things not nearly strong enough, but you can make those contractual requirements. You can put pieces in, hey, you must tell me within next number of days if you have a vulnerability. In the same respect, you have uptime requirements, SLAs, but must be up 99%. You can have the same thing here that can support you.
And here's a question from Judy. Hi, can John speak how this would apply to accountant services, QuickBooks, etc.?
Oh, so there's no getting around it. The majority of risk today doesn't come from the hard asset. It comes from the software. So if you've downloaded QuickBooks, right, you have the at-home version of it. This is something you need to be tracking vulnerability. What we find a lot of times is that the gap between known vulnerability and patch coming out is quite wide. And that's when we talk about cyber hygiene. This is one of the things you should be looking at when you purchase. How long does it take an organization to patch? And what you want to see there are sort of negative numbers. You want patches coming out before public vulnerabilities are made aware. So you need to check on that before you buy. Very easy to do if you want to do it manually. There's a ton of tools out there. My company does it. Competitors, I'm sure, do it. If you're looking at the web version of that, this is where things get a little trickier, right? And the ATO processes really aren't sufficient yet to do that. And what we're seeing is that Air Force is coming out with RMF next. Navy introduced CyberSafe. Army's working on a similar. So fortunately, in the most high-risk areas, they're doing this. But if you're a defense industrial-based organization, you need to be tracking this, because that's where your vulnerabilities are going to come from.
Okay, this came from the same attendee here. Is there any movement to using blockchain in supply chain implementations?
So I have a selfish answer to that, and I don't mean for it to be selfish. But it is a selfish answer. My company actually owns the only patent on that. So we have the patent on using blockchain for cybersecurity, specifically around ongoing supply chain patching. So I don't want to be too self-serving, but yes, they are doing that. My company's doing that. We have the patent on it. It exists.
Okay, there are two more questions here. So a question came in, how should we do this and where do I start?
Okay, so it depends on who you are. If you're in the DIB, right, look at it first from a compliance lens. Then normally I'm a big security guy, but look at it first from a compliance lens, because if you do the compliance, you will end up more secure and it scales nicely to your company size. So first, get an inventory of with whom you're working, right? Second, start ranking, okay, if this company is gonna blow up, what happens to me? Once you've done that, then if you need a tool, tools are available. If you feel like you don't need a tool, if you're a very small company, you might not need a tool, you're working with the big guys, just start putting some tracking feeds on there. Follow the CMMC standards, follow the NIST standards, you'll probably be good. Make sure you're entering those clauses into your contracts where you can. If you're part of the federal government, bigger thing here. So if you're a PM, do not let a contract out that does not have clauses about supply chain, because you are now responsible, particularly if you're in the DoD. It doesn't say contract officer, it doesn't say the cybersecurity division, it says PM. So again, you could be the PM of pencil buying or PM of satellite purchasing. You have to be doing this. It's now on your shoulders. So first place to start, always inventory, do the risk rank.
Okay, this will be the last question for you, John. How does NIST guidelines relate to CMMC and DOTI 5000.90?
So these things are all tightly coupled. And I think what we're going to see, we'll start with CMMC, right? Because this is what's burning everybody up. CMMC is really based on an older NIST standard that's just been updated. And if you look at the updated version, they have an entire section on supply chain. My bet is that CMMC will be updated to reflect the new NIST standard. Not dissimilarly, DOTI 5000 is largely about the practical implementation of these NIST standards. So it's saying, hey, here are the NIST standards, here are the best practices. Well, if you're a PM, how do you do that? And it literally goes line by line and really articulates how to do it. Now, what it doesn't do is give you funding. What it doesn't do is sort of backstop you. But again, that's why you got to consider this in your contract. And we should put a quantitative measure here, right? So a basic analysis, we're not talking millions of dollars here, right? We're talking hundreds or some thousands of dollars. If you're working on a satellite, it's going to be a different story. But most of the things we're buying are pretty common, and there's data sharing available. So think about it in that context, and that's the place to start, is make sure you're making that, task order 1, supply the good, task order 2, supply me about information about the supply chain.
Well, John, I can't thank you enough for sharing with us